Hello and welcome to our Citizens Assembly live webinar on how do we make it inclusive. And as ever, if you're watching on Facebook, Twitter or YouTube, please leave comments and questions in the comments section for our panel to pick up. And now I'm handing you over to your host for this evening, Sarah. Thanks very much. Enjoy.
Welcome everybody to this talk. Today we're going to be talking about how we can ensure that a Citizens Assembly is truly inclusive. This webinar is being live streamed, so welcome to everybody who's on Zoom and everybody on our various social media platforms. As Christian says, my name is Sarah and I'm from the Citizens Assembly Working Group of the UK Extinction Rebellion. And we're really thrilled today to have with us 5 speakers from 4 organisations who will be sharing their methods for selecting participants for citizens' assemblies and exploring different options and ideas to make the selection of participants more inclusive and fair. I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers. So we have Brett Hennig, who is an author and activist. He co-founded and directs the Sortition Foundation, has written The End of Politicians, Time for a Real Democracy, and his TED.com talk, What If We Replace Politicians with Randomly Selected People, has well over 1 million views. We have Marcin, Gerwin and Adela Gąsiorowska from the Centre for Climate Assemblies. Marcin designs and coordinates citizens' assemblies and is a specialist in deliberative democracy and sustainability. And Adela is a specialist in public social cooperation and citizen participation. Johan Galster is a partner and strategic advisor in We Do Democracy, with over 15 years of experience in citizen involvement, development processes and experience design, with a special focus on physical transformation processes. And Cecilie Astrupgaard is from Analyse Tal. She is a sociologist specialising in combining digital and traditional social science methods, and worked with We Do Democracy on their Citizens Lottery in Copenhagen. Johan and Cecilia are from different organisations, but as they've worked together on Citizens Assembly projects in Copenhagen, they'll be presenting together. Got a few housekeeping bits and pieces to go through before we get started. So for those of you watching on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, if you have any questions for us, please do put them in the comments section. And those of you on Zoom, can you put your questions in the chat at the bottom of your screen? We've got some other Citizens Assembly Working Group members, Alex and Keith, keeping an eye on the questions, and they'll be collating them so we can answer your questions after the presentations. The presentation will run for about 40 to 45 minutes, after which there will be some time to answer your questions, so please do put them in the chat as we go along. And if we don't manage to answer all your questions, please make sure that you tweet them at us or email them to us, and we will answer them after the webinar. To tweet them at us, you can use our Twitter handle @citizensxr, or email them to xr-citizensassembly@protonmail.com, and we'll be sharing the contact information at the end of the presentation as well. Many thanks also to Christian for helping us with the live streaming. We'll also be posting the video on our YouTube channel, CitizensXR, so please subscribe to our channel and look out for it there, and you'll also see some of our previous webinars there as well. Please could everybody on Zoom just make sure they've switched off their microphones and your camera, so this will be seen by everybody on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, and recorded so they'll all get a good view of the inside of your home or wherever you are sat, so please keep cameras off unless you're presenting. So why are we talking about selection methods for choosing the members of a Citizens Assembly? And just to clarify for everyone on the webinar, I'll go over briefly what is a Citizens Assembly and why it is XR's third demand. We do have a whole webinar dedicated to explaining what is a Citizens Assembly on our YouTube channel, CitizensXR, so I won't go into a huge amount of detail here, but I'll highlight some of the aspects of a Citizens Assembly that are useful to this discussion. So the third demand is sometimes referred to as beyond politics or beyond party politics, and what this refers to is that a Citizens Assembly on climate and ecological justice would be a national assembly commissioned by the government and committed to by the government as well. But because of the way a citizens' assembly works, it would be able to make recommendations and decisions independent of party political lines and ideologies. So you wouldn't have people voting on recommendations based on the party they belong to, but based on the evidence they've heard from experts and witnesses who would present to the assembly, and also based on their own deliberations with each other. One of the first things that's important to know about a citizens' assembly is that the participants in the assembly should be a fair and real representation of society. So a citizens' assembly is formed from the people who live in the country or region where a decision needs to be made, and who will live and breathe the changes that are made as a result of recommendations made by that citizens' assembly. Initially, the citizens' assemblies are selected using a process called sortition. So invitations are sent out to a randomly selected group, and then the responses are stratified using demographic data for the geographic region that the assembly is meant to reflect and make recommendations for. And this means that we have the right proportion of men and women, all different ages and ethnicities are represented, different social and economic backgrounds, maybe disability. They may even decide to stratify on whether they care about the issue being discussed, for example, climate change or not. Once the assembly is selected, they will hear from a panel of experts and witnesses, and then deliberate in small groups on the topics they've learnt about and the potential solutions that could be implemented. The key part here is the deliberation, where people talk and learn from each other, and they might share their thoughts and concerns and questions. Through deliberating together, they might share their point of view, or they might even change their minds about an issue, and that's how they come to those decisions. They will then draft and vote on recommendations, and the government will debate and implement the recommendations depending on the mandate they have given to the assembly. Some of the key benefits of a citizens' assembly are that they can think long term. They're not trying to get re-elected like politicians. They can break political deadlocks. They're not voting on party lines or ideologies. They're a fair and real representation of society. They're transparent, so all evidence presented is published or live streamed. Informed and discussed and deliberated recommendations are made, so they'll really think about the climate science as they make those recommendations. And that then there are clear instructions given to the government about what that assembly has decided it believes should be the way forward. So one of the criticisms of selecting for a citizens' assembly is, how do we include the most disenfranchised and marginalised individuals and communities in the process? And we wanted to ask our panel the question, can we actually have a citizens' assembly that is truly fair and inclusive? So the structure of our presentation this evening, or this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, is that our panel members are going to provide a short explanation based on their experience as to the selection processes they use for selection of assembly participants. And then we'll have a second round of presentations, excuse me, which is more directly relevant for XR's third demand, which is the call for a National Citizens' Assembly on climate and ecological justice. And each will address how such an assembly could actually be made inclusive. So how can it be made fairly representative? How can we make sure voices of minorities are heard? And how can we take on board the interests of the voiceless, including future generations and other species? So first of all, I'm going to hand over to Brett Hennig from the Sortition Foundation to start his presentation. So over to you, Brett.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks very much for the invitation to discuss our work here. As Sarah mentioned, I'm a co-founder and director of the Sortition Foundation. In the last year and a bit, we have done about 20 civic lotteries. And so I'll just run through quickly how we do those civic lotteries here in the UK, but we're also running a citizens' assembly in Budapest in Hungary, and we're also supporting selections in Australia, the US, Belgium, and other places around the world. The essential way that the Sortition Foundation does their selection is a two-step process. So the first step is you send out invitations to randomly selected households or people. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And from those who reply to that invitation, you do a second random selection. So I'll break that down a little bit. In the first step, we send out invitations to a group of randomly selected households in the UK is how we do it. We do that because in the UK, we think that the Royal Mail database is the best database we can have to give every person some probability of receiving an invitation. Of course, that's not completely true. We won't reach the homeless, we won't reach people in prison, etc. We won't, there's a few exceptions, of course, but that's the best database we think we can access in the UK to aim for that ideal of an equal probability of every person receiving an invitation. Because one very important aspect of that is that non-citizens are actually included. So even though it's called a citizens' assembly, any resident in the UK can respond to that invitation and register. The other interesting aspect is what would be the age limit? Traditionally, you would think 18 plus, but actually for nearly all the UK assemblies we've done, the age limit has been 16 plus. There's even been discussion of lowering that age limit further. So what is the cutoff for age is a very interesting question as well. In that first step where we send these invitations to randomly selected households, because we also realize, okay, we can only send it to a household. Should we let one person from a household register or not? We just let everyone from any household that receives an invitation register. But in the second step, we make sure that only one person from every household is selected maximum. We also realize that when people reply to these invitations, we get quite a bit of skewing. We get quite a bit of skewing towards the more educated people, sometimes toward older people, etc. So what we've been doing in the UK is to try to correct that skewing by actually sending more invitations to, proportionally more invitations to deprived areas. So for example, for the UK Climate Assembly, we sent out 30,000 invitations. 80% of those were just randomly selected from Royal Mail's database. And the further 20% were randomly selected from postcodes that had an index of multiple deprivation, a low index of multiple deprivation. So the more deprived regions, we topped up with an extra 20% of invitations to try to correct the skewing that we see in that first step. Then once people, the people that reply and register to those invitations, of course, it's not compulsory. We don't have the political power to make it compulsory yet. Even if we like to think of it like jury duty, we don't have the legislation to say, if you receive one of these, you have to come along, of course. So we get people who register, and then we do our second step, which is a stratified random selection. So because of this initial skewing, we don't just do a pure random selection from the pool. We make sure that when we do the random selection, we correct the skewing and we get 51% women, 49% men. We get the proportional numbers in each age group and according to some socio-economic proxy, which is often either education level or occupation, to try to match the actual socio-economic demographic profile of the community. How you actually perform that algorithm is also very interesting, and we've been working with some academics in the US, Ariel Prochacha, I'm not sure about the pronunciation of his surname, from Harvard University and Carnegie Mellon University on the actual selection algorithm from the pool that could be the most fairest. And in fact, there's various different ways you could define what is fair when you're selecting from this pool. And so the two algorithms we're being using at the moment, one is called Maximin and the other one is called the Nash welfare algorithm. And we can talk much more about what that means if people are so interested. In a nutshell, the Maximin increases any individual's minimum probability of being selected. So you put a sort of a baseline minimum on the sample, whereas the Nash welfare algorithm tries to minimize the spread of probabilities that you will be selected. So it tries to push everyone as close to a sort of central probability of being selected as possible. That's our selection mechanism in a nutshell. It's to recap, it's a two-step process. We send out invitations to randomly selected households. From those who register, we then do this second stratified random selection to make sure we match our demographic profile. In Budapest, in Hungary, where we're doing a citizens' assembly, it's different to the UK because, of course, in continental Europe, they have national registers of residents. So in Budapest, the Budapest City Council has access to the Budapest City Register, and they have randomly selected 10,000 specific people from their database to send the initial invitations to. So that's very different to the UK, where you will get actually a name, addressed invitation, you have been selected to register. But again, the other parts of the process are exactly the same. Some proportion of those people will register. From that pool, we will do the stratified second step random selection. And yeah, I'll leave it there. I think that's a very quick outline of how we do it at the Sortition Foundation.
Thanks very much, Brett. So next we're going to move over to Marcin and Adela, who are going to talk a little bit about their selection method at the Centre for Climate Assemblies. So over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It was really a pleasure for me to listen to Brett, because I'm kind of a geek on those methods, and actually I'm very interested in all of this. And in general, we follow the same basic principles of two-step random selection. However, there is more to it when we do it in Poland. For me, it was from the very beginning, you know, a couple of years ago, when I first started to speak about the random selection process, immediately someone from the city council, it was not Gdańsk, it was the city Sopot where I live, someone pointed out, but when you do it electronically, how can you make sure that it is like a credible random selection? How can you make it trustworthy? And even though it was many years ago, I really like it's stuck in my mind. So it translates into our method, which is as transparent as possible. So wherever it's possible, we use something physical and visible. And let me explain what I mean by this. So I have prepared a presentation, and there are some slides for you to show. Yes, so we will be revealing the secrets of random selection in Poland. All right, so we have tried both of the methods, just like Brett mentioned, the methods of sending letters of invitations to households. We have done it in the city of Wrocław this year, so we have experience with this. And we have done 4 times the method of sending personal letters with invitations to an individual. We had this opportunity of using an actual voters register. If you are a homeless person, you can add yourself to the voters register. It is possible to do it. And there are a couple of differences between those 2 methods. So, for example, in Gdańsk, during the first Citizens' Assembly in 2016, there were almost 9,000 letters with invitations sent out, and the response rate was 10%. So we have this step of people registering on the website or by phone. I will show you how it looks like in a minute. And in the city of Wrocław, there was this household method, and the number of letters was much higher. It was 20,000, and the response rate was lower. So, however, we have received this more than 800 positive responses. So it was completely enough for us to randomly select the ideal composition of the whole group. Nevertheless, when you do it with the voters register, you have from the very beginning 3 demographic criteria to start with. You already know the district where the person lives. You know the age of this person, exact age, because in the special ID number that people have in Poland, which is called PESEL, you have exact date of birth. And also in this number, you have gender. So you know already at the very beginning, 3 categories or demographic categories, and you can target the letters specifically to those groups to increase your rate of positive responses, and to actually not to risk increase, but to have a better chances for the perfect composition of your of your citizens' assembly. And when you do it with households, you have only one demographic criteria. You know only where the person lives. You know only the household. So, and this is just to show you, these are the letters with invitations from the city of Wrocław as they were used this year. There were two sheets of paper inside. One was the invitation from the mayor, and then the second one was something that we have learned from the Sortition Foundation experience. This is the frequently asked questions. And just to show you, this is these are the boxes with 20,000 letters, which are ready to be posted. That's what it looks like. So, and for the electronic random selection, we use the Irish website, random.org, because of what is called a true randomness. It means that something physical is used for random selection, not just the algorithm, but in their case, they use radio receivers to capture the noise of the atmosphere. So if you ask, how did you select those 20,000 letters of invitations? Well, they were selected by the noise of the atmosphere. And this is their phased radio receiver. It was supposed to be old because they wanted to have a radio receiver which didn't have this noise filter, which modern radios use. So, and when you receive a letter with invitation, there is a special website. You can register there, or you can call someone. And there in the city of Wrocław, for example, there was a person especially hired for answering the phone calls and registering people. And once you have this whole group of, let's say, 800 people registered, then there is this new step that we had to do in the city of Wrocław, is to randomly select those profiles, demographic profiles of people before the second round of random selection. And for this, to explain how we did it, I asked Adela because she invented the method. Adela, so over to you.
Hi everyone. I'm also going to show you a presentation. So as Marcin said, we also invented a method, an algorithm for choosing people who will take part in an assembly when we get registered people in household method. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I hope that it's visible now. And I call it one-by-one method. And as I said, our aim is to create a group of profiles that is as close to the demographic structure of the city as it's possible. And on the beginning, we have around 800, maybe 1,000 registered people who have different demographic profiles. Because when we organize an assembly, we set different demographic criteria, which are, for example, gender and age of a person, level of education, district of living, and if it's climate assembly, an attitude to the climate change. So when people who get invitation registers, then we have around, let's say, 1,000 of people who have different demographic profiles. And here on the presentation, we have an example of the profile. And we also have a limited number of places in our assembly, let's say 75 places. And we know that we want to have there a structure of the city or of the country where the assembly is organized. So, for example, we want to have 40 women and 35 men, or maybe 20% people from first district, etc. And our aim on this level is to match registered people with specific profiles to these proportions in the assembly. And now I'm going to shortly explain how we do it. The main rule is that we complete in each criterion the features of the person one by one. So it means that, for example, if in the first step I selected a person with the profile I showed you before, in the second step I will select a person who don't have any of these features. So the person shouldn't be a woman in the between 18 and 25 years. So I will select only from men and women in different age groups, and at the same time people with different level of education from different districts and with different attitudes to climate change. We do it, no, it will be more technical. We do it by marking some features as temporarily used. It means that if I selected, for example, a woman in this age group, in the next step, I mark this specific feature as temporarily used. So it means that I can't, in the next step select people with this feature. But when I give a place for each of the features from the criteria, then I can mark them back, which means that, for example, if I have 2 districts, and in the first step I selected person from first district and I marked this as used, and on the second step I selected a person from the second district, I can unmark these features back because I have completed one by one all the features in this criteria. But also I have to mark the features as permanently used, and I do it when I complete the places that are for this feature, which means that, for example, if I want to have 15 people from the first district, when I have already selected 15 people from this district, I have to mark this feature as used because I can't anymore have people with this feature. Unfortunately, it's not always possible to have people who don't have any of the unused features. So we also set some, let's say, conflict rules, which tell us who should we select when we don't have anyone with unmarked features. And the first and the most easy rule is to select people who have less features marked as temporarily used. But there are more of them, but we don't have enough time to present them all. So at the end, I can say that this method gave us almost perfect match. We used it once in Wrocław, but it was, as I said, almost perfect match, and our group was 800 registered people. And the more registered people we have, the it's more possible to have a perfect match because we have more profiles to use. And we also create let's say, universal algorithm, which can be used both manually and by computer program. In Wrocław, we did it halfly manually in the Excel, as you can see on the picture, and using website Random, which Marcin mentioned. But we are going also to transfer it to the computer program, and I hope that we will be soon able to share it with you also in English. Okay, so now I can pass it back to Marcin.
Thank you, Adela. So just to clarify, first step, we send letters with invitations. Second step, people register. And then there is this step like in the middle where we randomly select profiles with demographic criteria. This is the step that Adela just described. We hope to have a software soon because due to our like transparency rules, we have done it live on the internet for 6 hours. Not straight, there was a break in between, and Adela also made some breaks, you know, to eat something or something like this. But we are trying to develop those methods in such a way that we can prove that it was done everything was done correctly. And if there is a mistake, which happens, there is an option of amending it. So just to complete our method, let me show you what are the final steps. So again, to have everything as transparent as possible, once we have this group of, let's say, 800 people, then we select final members of the Citizens Assembly by rolling a dice. And again, it is transmitted live on the internet. There is a special software developed for it. And for example, here you can see the TV studio in the city of Gdańsk. and it is transmitted on the website of the city or on the Facebook, for example. So it's as transparent as possible, and even to make sure that every step was done correctly, there is a history of this random selection, which you can have a look into, and just to be sure that these are the profiles which were really selected. And one more thing that I would like to add: when people register, when they receive this letter of invitation, they have a special ID code, and they use this code to register on the website. And you can see the codes during the random selection when the dice is being rolled. So people can verify whether their code is visible on the screen and whether it is included in the history. So if you have any questions for more details, here is the contact. And thank you very much for this part.
Thanks, Marcin and Adela. That was really interesting you were transmitting it live. Let's move on now finally to Johan and Cecilie to hear about their experiences of selecting for citizens' assemblies in Copenhagen.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the invitation to be a part of this webinar and the detailed inspiration from Poland. I'm Johan Galster, well pronounced, Sarah. I'm a partner in We Do Democracy. And we are the organization located in Copenhagen, and we are advisors in participation design and democracy. And last year, we had the opportunity to design and facilitate the first citizen assembly in Copenhagen. And we did that in very close collaboration with Peter McLeod and from Mass LBP and his team from Toronto. The mayor of the technical and environmental administration in Copenhagen was looking for this kind of a new citizen dialogue format with a broader representative reach than the dialogue with the usual suspects, so to speak, from the typical town hall meetings. And we came up with this citizen assembly, and the question for this citizen assembly was, how can we reduce car traffic and parking places in the central part of Copenhagen and create more livability in the future? And so that's about the topic for this discussion. And maybe you know, but we are not that religious in Denmark. But when it comes to reducing car traffic and parking places, especially the one in front of your front door, and transforming these streets into green urban parks or whatever, then we have very strong opinions and also very strong stakeholders in the city to be a part of that debate. We made this the citizen assembly as mentioned before, the concept around it, for making it more representative. And my colleague from the Danish research agency Analyse Tal, I think you can translate that into analyses and numbers. Cecilie Astrupgaard will tell you about how we did the selection of the participants in Copenhagen and the Civic Lottery. But I will just give you a short cliffhanger of how it ended up. Because in the end of the citizen assembly, 36 Copenhageners with different backgrounds and different views on traffic and car traffic, on infrastructure, ended up with a very strong recommendation for the City Hall, agreed on reducing 75% of all car traffic in the city center for the future, and reducing 80 to 90% of all parking places. And that process, there was not a single minority statement during this time. So, and right now, the politicians at the City Hall are still discussing the recommendation for the future Copenhagen municipality plan. But that's the overall frame about the citizen assembly in Copenhagen. And well, Cecilie, I would like you to give the introduction to the Civic Lottery that we did.
Sure, and thanks, Johan. Well, let me just share our presentation. All right, so here we are. I guess you can see it. So as Johan said, we have this question about imagine a future with less car traffic in central Copenhagen. And we worked with different scenarios of how to reduce car traffic and what it would actually mean for the city, for the streets, for the parks, for everything. And what we would like to highlight was, of course, the selection process. Here it's kind of important that we didn't just want to have what's representative, because we had an issue about a very specific area in Copenhagen. So we wanted to be representative on age and gender, but geography was something that we discussed a lot. So we actually invited all citizens in the specific area that was touched, but they only made out 75% of the overall citizen assembly. We also had 25% living in the area around that was like coming into the center, because of course for them it also meant quite a big deal if they could park or not. So the geography was a very interesting thing to work with. How would we make what is fair? What is a fair selection? Is it representative, but representative of what? Also, we had something, as Johan said, we are kind of religious about our cars and our streets and our homes in Denmark. So we actually included maybe more, I guess it wasn't something that I would normally use for a random selection for a citizen assembly, but access to car became like actually a selection criteria for us, because we needed to have perspectives for both all the citizens who had their own car, and for them it was of course a much bigger deal that they couldn't park just in front of their house, and also a representative proportion of people without car. So already the selection criteria process was a lot of discussions in there, and I guess we will dive deeper into it later of how we could maybe make it even more inclusive. Then we had invitation and civic lottery, maybe the two phases that Britt and Marcin is also talking about. But what we would like to highlight from our Danish experience is the invitation process, because here we use two different methods and we have pros and cons from both of them, really. So in Denmark, we have the ID numbers of all citizens, and the ID numbers is also connected to like an official citizen email where we get like all our salary emails, our governmental communication and stuff. So we had this e-box, we call it, which is like a separate email that everybody uses. And we were able to use that, which was like a really great opportunity for us. But then due to some practical, economic, political, at least, limitation, we also we had to use social media and official government website to recruit the 25% citizens like around the center. And that's what we want to talk a bit about. So here you can see we have the e-box, which here we are able to, when we are working with municipalities and cities and do citizen assemblies, then this is a great way, because you can actually invite all individuals with the address in a specific geographical place. So so the first step is not even a selection. We actually invite everyone, and we're doing this right now in 2 different municipalities. And of course, I can see I missed. Yeah. So the pros here is that you target individuals and not households. So everybody in a household is getting an invitation. You can also invite people under 18, as you said, Brett. We are also working now in our second citizen assembly with inviting everyone from 16 and up, and that's also possible with e-box, which is really a pro here. And what we also found was that e-box were actually giving us a very wide range of respondents in all our criteria. We were a little uncertain if all the young people will use it, but actually they do. And that's the great thing about e-Box. We are so used to using it in Denmark, both the old and the young. So it's, for us, it's like, I think it is the best way to do it. But it was interesting to experiment with Facebook and the government official website to also recruit from, because this was more gambling, and we were very skeptical to say at least, because it kind of break with some of the transparency criteria, because you don't know exactly who will see the post on Facebook and who will answer it. So we were definitely advising the municipality not to use this method, but there were some political issues that made it impossible for them to not do it. So now we actually have 25% of the citizen assembly coming from this recruitment method, and 75% coming from the e-Box, which is definitely more, representative, because we know all who were target, all who answered, and then we can do the random stratified selection, as you also mentioned, both of you. But it was not difficult to get people to respond through social media. It's not like we had enough people responding to it, but it definitely, it was kind of interesting that it was difficult to get the very young people to answer through social media. I think they're already on other platforms, so Facebook and websites is actually too traditional for them. And then, of course, it was mostly the bias targeting that was a huge problem when we were reporting it. But of course, we would like to discuss it more with you guys. Through e-Box, I just wanted to say we included an online survey link in the invitation from the mayor. So all the citizens got a survey link where they responded to all questions about the selection criteria. And then we ended up with a gender profile, age profile, geography. If you were here, these are the 25% from the outer Copenhagen, and these are the 75% from the central Copenhagen. Then we have an economy, and here we based economy based on what living situation they had, if they owned their apartment or their house, or if they rented it. And then we have the access to car or not, and doing it representative to the whole Copenhagen. Yes, and this was our representative faces of Copenhagen for the first citizen assembly in Denmark. We made this fall 2019. And I guess that was it from us, unless you want to add something, Johan. I guess not. Sarah?
Thanks, Cecilia. That was really interesting to hear about the e-Box situation there. So we're going to move on to the second part of the presentation now. And I just want to remind people to please do submit your comments through social media or on Zoom. If you have any questions that you want to ask the panel, please pop them into the comment section or the chat section on Zoom. We've had a few questions already, so thank you very much to those people on social media and Zoom who've posted questions already. Okay, so the next part is addressing how we can ensure that an assembly can be made more inclusive. How can we make it more fairly representative, make sure the voices of minorities are heard, and also maybe take into account the interests of the voiceless, including future generations and other species. So again, we're going to start with Brett from the Sortition Foundation and ask him to address this question first of all. Over to you, Brett.
Thanks again, Sarah. Yeah, inclusion to me is, of course, crucial. And the way I see inclusion in Citizens Assembly is there are essentially two modes of inclusion, or two sort of areas of inclusion. And one is the direct mechanism of selection. So you are selected and put in that room, and that is obviously one of the more powerful ways of inclusion. And there's a great book by Anne Phillips called Politics of Presence, if you're looking for something to read about the power of representation in that method. The other way of inclusion is actually in the sort of expert stakeholder panel. And the first mode of inclusion, if you're randomly selected to participate and it is like a microcosm of society, then that is a very formal mode, and you have a sort of a formal power in the sense that you and the group of people in that room will be making the final decisions. Whereas the sort of second mode of inclusion, where you are an expert or a stakeholder or such like, there's no formal power, but there's a lot of informal power because your voice is elevated, your experience is elevated. So if you're talking about transport and you want to make sure that the voice of disabled people is included in that assembly, you can either do stratification in the selection to make sure that 10% of that room self-identify as having a disability, or you can get disabled people up as a stakeholder group and to present their point of view. And they're very different ways of exercising power in a citizens' assembly, as far as I'm concerned. Of course, there is quite a bit of precedence for oversampling on historically excluded groups or minorities in the first selection mechanism. So, for example, in Australia, where I'm from, originally there was a deliberative poll on Indigenous reconciliation. And so, of course, they overrepresented the Indigenous in that deliberative poll to make sure that their voice was very loud and clearly heard. In the G1000 in Belgium, I know they allocated 10% of the seats to minorities and hard to reach individuals, and they just used direct outreach strategies to make sure that some homeless people were brought in, for example. Over-representation is another way of sort of reaching for exclusion. But there's still, of course, many other groups that will definitely be excluded. Children, for example, if you're under 16, is your voice not important in this argument? Other species, of course, plants, animals, oceans, things like that, is their voice very important? I mean, this is something that's just beginning to be grappled with, as far as I can tell, on in the sort of climate assemblies. Although, I mean, there's a famous book back from 1972, Christopher Stone's "Should Trees Have Standing?" Toward Legal Rights for Natural Objects. I mean, this is a very old text which is trying to argue that, like corporations have legal personhood, so to speak, maybe natural objects should also have legal personhood. Of course, even if a corporation, you can be sued by a corporation, or you can sue a corporation. Could you be sued by a tree, or could you sue a tree? Well, in places like New Zealand, they've just gave legal personhood to the, I've written it here, Wanganui River, for example. And I also know that in the US, Lake Erie on the US-Canada border, they tried to give that legal personhood. It was struck down by a judge, apparently. Again, legal personhood is very different to political personhood. So what would this mean to actually bring those voices into an assembly? Would you use method A in the sense of you put someone with decision-making power in that assembly who speaks for the trees, so to speak, or would you just get them in a stakeholder role where people go up there who know a lot about forestry or know a lot about ecology, etc.? Future generations and the children is very interesting as well. For example, in Wales, there is a Future Generations Commissioner. So this commissioner is meant to bring the voice of future generations into every policy discussion. So that would obviously be a sort of obvious choice for someone to include in a citizens' assembly, probably at the stakeholder level, I would imagine. I mean, it's a big debate, I think, in my mind at least, about which method of inclusion is legitimate for which kind of input. So they're the ideas I'd throw out there. There's no easy answer, I don't think. It's a good debate. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Brett. That was fascinating to hear about that river in New Zealand. That's really incredible. And also to hear about the difference between legal and political status as well. It's not really clear that there was a distinction between the two, but yeah, you're right. That's a really interesting concept. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Marcin and Adela now to hear a bit more about their thoughts on this topic.
All right. So from my perspective, it is important also to have a standard for inclusion of all people who were not selected to become the members of the Citizens Assembly. So for example, we have this principle of openness, and it means that any citizen can send a comment, a proposal, a suggestion to the Citizens Assembly, to the members of the Citizens Assembly. It's like an open call for submissions. And the second rule that we use is that all stakeholders, non-governmental organizations, institutions, are invited. And it means also in practice, we call it the principle of non-selecting stakeholder. If you are an NGO, for example, who is active in the field of climate change, and the topic of the Citizens Assembly is climate change, you are invited automatically. We don't select, like there is a 100 NGOs and we choose pick this one, that one, and that one, and the rest, goodbye. You're not, no. So for us, this part is very important also. Inclusion for us is hearing the suggestions of stakeholders when we create the program. Which expert should be invited? Which topics should be selected? This is all consulted with stakeholders. Now, with regards to the composition of the Citizens Assembly, we use only four basic, normally we use the basic four demographic criteria: age, gender, education level on the city, and when it's a city, then a district. When it's a country level, then also all regions. In Poland, we have 16 voivodeships, so every voivodeship should be also included. And also we would check rural area, urban area, small city, big city. Plus, I agree that those attitudinal questions, such as how concerned are you with regards to climate change, or what is your basic choice of transportation? Is it a car? Is it a bicycle? We have done it in the city of Wrocław because the topic is transportation. So, but with regards to the inclusion, I see a huge, from my perspective, it is the outcome of the Citizens Assembly, which is very important. It is the, by outcome, I mean the recommendations. And it is secondary of how this, how the influence is exercised. Is it through the member of a Citizens Assembly, or is it through being a stakeholder who is able to present your position to the Citizens Assembly, and in this way have influence on the final recommendations? And just one more thing with regards to the young people. For example, when we were talking about the education, what can be done to increase the level of civic engagement with regards to young people, we wanted to hear voice of the youth. By youth, I mean like the not primary school, not high school, but the middle, gymnasium at that time. So we didn't include like 1 or 2 members of children in this group of Citizens Assembly. We have organized a workshop for like 30 or 40 randomly selected children. We have a special methodology of how to do it. And through this workshop, we have come up with their recommendation so that their voice is also like they had opportunity to learn about the issue, to think it over, to discuss it, and then to present it to the Citizens Assembly. Adela, your comment on this issue?
No, thank you. I think that is all.
Right. Sarah, so over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcin. That was really interesting about the balance between being a member of the Assembly and being a stakeholder, and which could have the most impact. So thank you very much for that. Let's now hand over to Johan and Cecilia for their comments and thoughts on this.
Thank you. It's a very yeah, of course, very important discussion, this one. How can we do this fair and inclusive? And I think I love the idea of course, I love this transparency focus that you're doing in Poland. I love this case from Australia by putting in those voices that is kind of voiceless into the room. I'm just wondering, how could we design those citizen assemblies in the ways though that we can see it physically, the one that is not in the room but should be in the room for having this fair discussion. And then going back to the citizen assemblies that we are doing here in Denmark, Copenhagen, if we should design a new citizen assembly with this thinking, I would say we could have 36 representative citizens, and let's say 4 silent members designing this with 4 empty chairs in the room, so that actually you can see the voices that is not actually physically in the room. And we can use a kind of advocates for each chair, advocating for the perspective of the voiceless in the room, just like in the courtroom. So if we are going to do the same citizen assembly in Copenhagen, we could make a reservation for the homeless Copenhageners, the future Copenhageners, the Copenhageners in prison, the biodiversity of the city, or the air above the city. So it's actually it's a part of the room, it's a part of the discussion, and we can have advocates for those perspectives. It's probably not the only answer for this for this challenge and how we can do this, but I think you have to be a part of the design. I don't know, Cecilie, if you can add anything perspective to this.
Well, okay, this is interesting. This is interesting, Johan, just your creativity of how to actually design the process. I think that's why we work together, because on my notes, I was more like, what did we do and what didn't we do? And you're already thinking, what could we do? And that's great, because what I would say was maybe more in Brett's comments. So in just the case of Copenhagen, we had, for instance, the city architect who came and actually had a stakeholder presentation of the history of Copenhagen. How could the history be an actor or be a voice in the city or in the citizen assembly? So I think the stakeholder design is like one way to include, but I also think we should be much more creative in both like invitations and stuff. Even the homeless people in Copenhagen, they actually do have e-box, but I'm pretty sure that they are not the one responding to the survey, but actually they do have a chance to be selected. But that's another thing. We should definitely maybe also be even more critical about the 5 to 10% who are responding to the invitations. That's also another way to think about inclusiveness. I think maybe people who have worked even more with citizen assembly also have a lot of insights on how to invite people and how to frame the citizen assembly. What is it? And I think there's a lot of ways to invite people in that could actually include more people. And that's maybe something we should think about on a more intellectual level. Maybe we have like one way of including people through words, but that could maybe also be done through other medias or other framings. So I think there are actually, this topic expand over like so many phases of the citizen assembly, and not only the selection really, also the way we design and facilitate the meetings, but also the way we are even talking about it, just to open it up even more. Sarah.
Fantastic, thank you all. So we have got some questions from the audience, but I just wondered if you had any initial questions for each other or any clarifications you wanted to ask each other, and I'll pick out the questions that we want to go through from the audience. Okay, Marcin, you have a question?
Comment.
A comment, sure, go for it.
Just very quickly, because like my honest way of thinking about the composition of the Citizens Assembly is that it's really not that important, even if it may sound a bit controversial, you know, coming from me, because it seems to me that it is also the process that is important. And if the composition is like a bit that way, like more men, more women, something like this, what I believe is that when you design the whole process right, you engage you start with the collective, you initiate the collective wisdom of people. And what we know from many studies which have been done throughout, you know, more than 10 years or something like this, that people during the Citizens' Assembly do change their opinion, their position. So it's not as important where they stand, because once they hear the evidence, once they hear those different diverse perspectives, they have this ability to move towards something which is considered a collective wisdom. And even if, you know, if our composition of the group is not 51 and it should be 50 or 49 or something like this, I think it's irrelevant, because the process, when you design it right, has this ability of people to come up with something really good and valuable. Okay, that would be it.
Thanks, Marcin. That was, yeah, really interesting to hear that perspective about how the design and the deliberation maybe trumps the selection in some circumstances, to see how that can make the process more inclusive. Okay, we do have some questions from the audience, so I'm going to pick out a couple now. So we have a question from Paul on Zoom. He's on our Zoom webinar today. So typically you send out invitations to randomly selected households and get a response rate of around 5%. So maximum 10%, I think you said in one of the examples from Poland, with 95% not replying. So that's 95% not included in that process. So to check on how representative or unrepresentative your sampling cohort is, not just relying on the final selected sample matching broad demographic quotas, have you compared the properties of the 5% who reply and the 95% who don't reply to the initial mailed invite? And what does that analysis show? And how would you correct for systematic non-response bias from this recruitment and selection process? Who wants to address that question first?
Brett, I'm thinking about you. I'm leaving the space for you because I would like to comment, but I don't want to be the first one this time.
I mean, I can. The very short answer is no. We haven't compared the property, the 95% to the 5% reply. We don't have the resources to do that at the moment. There are some studies. There is a study by Jacques Vincent, I think it is, in a Belgian university, where he reached out to the people who didn't reply to the thing, and he looked at the excuses why they didn't reply. By far, the largest excuse was simply didn't have the time. That on the weekend they were busy, essentially, or they had family, etc. There were other excuses in there, but they weren't. Yeah, they were just very practical in a sense. Or I think the second most popular was something like, we think it's just a talk shop that has no power. In terms of, yeah, I mean, of course, there's this element of self-selection to the invitation response, and that's a massive issue. And as I said before, if this could be a legalized, institutionalized thing where it was mandatory to go along, we wouldn't have that problem, but we don't have that power. It's a voluntary activity. How do we try to increase the rates of response? We pay people to come along. So hopefully that comes across some barriers for inclusion for people who may have to give up time for work. We offer free childcare. We offer support for carers. So, for example, if your carer has to come along, of course, they're more than welcome. If you have a young child, they will either cover childcare or set up a creche at that spot, at that place. We do everything we can to try to make it as accessible as possible. Of course, as you know, there can be sign language, there can be braille things, all this kind of stuff. We do our best essentially to try to support the inclusion as far as we can. I mean, the other thing that's really important to me, though, is that what Johan, I think, mentioned, it's not your usual suspects. It's crucially different to an open meeting. And this is really important. If you just say, let's have an open meeting about climate change, of course you know who's going to turn up. If you randomly select people, even if only 5 or 10% respond, it is not your usual suspects. It is so different from an open meeting, or so different from the people who discuss this topic if they're elected to discuss that topic, that it's a whole new ball game. And that's where its power lies. Of course, it's not perfect. We're nowhere near getting the selection mechanism perfect. Marcin? Marcin or
I think it's a, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a central thing in itself that you actually got this letter from the government. It's a part of the democracy that actually we need your voice, even though only 95% or 90% actually are going to be a part of the civic lottery. Then I think it's a criteria in democracy that you actually have been looked at, that the government would like to hear your voice into this subject. So that is a criteria in itself. We shouldn't kind of, and on the other hand, like Brett said, well, we definitely have some other citizens involved in these debates and in these assemblies, especially in Copenhagen and in Denmark, than the typical town hall meeting. So this is not going to be the only solution. Citizen assembly is good for something, and we can use it for some purpose, but not you cannot save the whole democracy only by using a citizen assembly. You have to. It's a tool together with other tools, but we have to admit that I think this invitation to so many people, that kind of having this opportunity to be a part of a democracy process, and this civic lottery is a central part of itself.
Marcin, do you want to add your comments now?
Yeah, just briefly, from my perspective, it is very important that your participation in the Citizens' Assembly is actually voluntary. Why? Because you are willing to participate rather than you are forced to participate. And your attitude to being the member of the Citizens' Assembly, to listen to those presentations, to be engaged in the discussions is very different. I think that this forced mechanism of like when it's during a jury, for example, I don't think that the attitude that it promotes is the right one. And also, I wouldn't say that 19%, like it was stated in the question, are not included. Yes, they are not included, but they had opportunity to be included, and either they were not able to, which is fine, because, for example, someone has got a job during the weekend, and this is okay. Maybe, next year or in the 2 years or 5 years, the situation will change. He or she will receive the invitation again and will be able to participate. Or there will be a process on the weekdays, which is also possible. So and I think that when people, from my perspective, the group that we receive is diverse enough, is representative enough, and we are looking for the people with regards to those demographic criteria to reflect the composition of the whole city. And this works, during the third Citizens' Assembly in Gdańsk, we have randomly selected a person who was unemployed on social benefits and a professor of biology from the University of Gdańsk, just by random selection.
Thanks, Marcin. That's really interesting perspective there. Do we have any further comments from the panel, from Cecilie or Adela, or should we move on to the next question? Okay, great. Okay, so the next question we have, so somebody's asked, what if the majority of people you select, this is thinking very much about the Citizens' Assembly on climate and ecological justice. So what if the majority of people you select for this particular Citizens' Assembly actually disagree with Extinction Rebellion? And who from the panel would like to address that one first? Brett.
I mean, I don't want to speak first all the time. If anyone else wants to jump in, please do. Of course, people should disagree. That's the whole point. You should have a diverse range of viewpoints in the room. So, in fact, also for the UK Climate Assembly, we stratified on level of climate concern. So we asked people when they registered, were they extremely worried? Were they not worried? Were they not at all worried? And we matched the final sample against an Ipso Mori poll done 6 months ago or something, to match the numbers in that room to make sure that it couldn't be accused of being a room full of people who care about climate change. And it would be not legitimate because it would be assumed to be a stacked room or something. So we have to make sure that in that room there was the same percentage of people who did not care about climate change. And to me, this is actually more interesting because seeing if they do or do not change their opinion throughout this process is really important. And I mean, anecdotally, you see people coming through the French Climate Assembly coming out saying, oh my God, I had no idea how dramatic it was, etc. And that's, of course, the whole point. You get this representative random sample of people and put them through informed deliberation and see if their opinion changes, if their perspective changes.
Thanks, Brett. Any further comments from the panel on that one, or anyone want to counter Brett's comments? Okay, move on to the next question. So what do you think about the role of education? This is from Rita, who's on Zoom as well. So what do you think about the role of education to encourage participation in the Assembly?
Well, yeah. I'm not sure if it's about education, perhaps about reaching out to people that the most important one would be people see citizens' assemblies as a valuable, trustworthy process which delivers recommendations which are implemented. Actually, then they would not be recommendations anymore, they would be decisions being implemented, having a real life influence on the impact on the lives of people. And also trusting that the process is designed in a fair way and it's something attractive to participate. I might probably, I'm not sure, but it's very probable that I will never be a participant of a citizens' assembly, and I really would like to be one. Just think about it. You are invited with this great, mail, letter of invitation from the mayor or the president or the prime minister, and he invites you in our method personally. Oh great. So I invited. Then I come to this meeting. I meet many wonderful people. Like for the first time, I'm able to speak with people from those different age groups, different districts and so on. And there is this integrational phase, and the facilitators are nice. They're running the process really smoothly. And then the experts come. There is this phase when I learn about this issue. I have opportunity to speak about it, to think about it. And my decisions, my recommendations are taken into account. So I have an influence on the real life of people of the city, and they pay me. It's fantastic. Then give me food. They give me wonderful cake. At least in Poland, we serve cakes. So why not participate in such a process? Just the most important part actually would be for people to learn, to get used to it, to be familiar with it. And once the word spreads, but the cake is fantastic, I think the response rate should go up to 100%.
I am a huge fan of cake as being a tempting way to draw people into a citizens' assembly. Anyone else have any opinions on the question, or on cake in general? Actually, anyone else got any thoughts on that question? Okay, let's move on to the next question. Thank you, Marcin. So, got a question from Kathy on Zoom. What are the panelists' views on random selection by telephone that was used for the French Climate Convention? Who wants to start with that one?
Oh, okay, I can jump in quickly. It is fine. Yes, it's just a method of randomly selected people. What I would think about is what is the actual cost, what is the response rate, and so on. But is it a good way? Is it like a fair way? Yes, it's okay. It's just like any other method. However, I'm a bit attached to this personal letter with invitations. I think it's a nice way of inviting people, and if it works, then it's fine. So I would just compare the costs, and I would also make sure that everyone, depending on the country, if everyone has got a cell phone, for example, or a phone, because in Poland, definitely many people don't use the internet at all. So I would say in our final group of assembly members, I would say around 10% would not have a personal email address at all. That's the situation in Poland.
Thanks, Marcin. Yeah, it's interesting because there's also the methodology used in Ireland where they recruited door to door. So they actually knocked on doors to do that recruitment. And in a sense, it's down to that level of the cost effectiveness. You know, does that trump the actual general effectiveness of the selection method? Which is more effective? Is there a difference between them? Anyone else from the panel got any thoughts about that, the use of telephone or even door-to-door selection methods over using electronic or direct mail options? Johan?
Yeah, I think we have to make a distinction between the kind of open invitation, when you are making a broad invitation to the municipality, to the citizen in the municipality or in the nation, and the more closed invitation where you're using the phones, because I think there's a democratic impact in itself in having those broad invitation to this discussion, because you have to know by using those broadly invitation, then you are starting up a debate not only for the citizen actually being represented in the citizen assembly, but also in a broader way. So, and I do agree that both way of recruitment citizen to the citizen assembly are fair, but I think the impact of using the more open invitation to the citizen, yeah, I prefer that in the broader sense, and also in having a living democracy, actually asking the citizen to be a part of the democracy.
Yeah, that's really important. Just to have that opportunity to be part of that process is really important. Any more comments from the panel before we move on to the next question? We've got time for a couple more questions. So we'll just take a couple more from the audience. If you have any questions you want to add, please put them in the chat or in the comments now. No, okay, so we'll move on to the next question. So sort of touched on this a little bit already, but I wonder if we can just get a little bit extra from this. So expecting potential participants to respond to an unsolicited letter is likely to reduce the response from politically marginalised social groups, especially among communities with refugee and migrant backgrounds. How can we encourage an increased response rate from these groups? Who wants to take that one first? Marcin? Great, thank you.
All right, but it seems to me that actually Brett mentioned it, that you can oversample when you know that there are areas where people with this background live, then you can send more letters with invitations. You can also promote, because that's what we do in Poland. We have this advertising campaign with posters, you know, with leaflets and so on, to promote that the Citizens Assembly is starting. But I'm also, like, from my perspective, it is very important that only people who register, only people who have received the actual invitation can register. Why? Because there is still this not some level, there is self-selection at this level. even once you have received the letters of invitation, you decide, do I want to be part or not? However, I think that it is important that the step of first round of random selection is taken. Why? Because once you have the open access, like everyone can register, and then you have a random selection, then you could possibly have a biased group to start with. For example, if your topic is whether or not we should have a new football stadium in a city, then it's theoretically possible that a large group of football fans will register to participate, let's say 5,000, and then 800 like regular citizens. Then from the very beginning, it is likely that you will have a large number of football fans in your group of members of a citizens assembly, and this group will be biased. That is why this first step of randomly selection is important. And that is why whether it is by phone, by knocking on the door, or by sending letters with invitation, it should go only to the randomly selected group. And this makes this like attracting people like more a bit harder. But there are some methods like oversampling, which Brett mentioned, that you could actually use.
Thank you, Marcin. Any further comments from the panel on Marcin's comments there?
Okay, so I can add something.
Great,
because,
thank you.
Even if less people will register from some of the district which is somehow excluded, on the beginning we assume that we will have the proper amount of places in our assembly. So even less people register from this district, they will be chosen to the panel, because we know that we have to have this presentation of it in our assembly. And additionally, the other method of including them in the assembly is to ask them to be stakeholders, because the representations of the districts are also stakeholders, and they can show their opinion to the rest of the members of the assembly.
Yes, thank you, Adela. That's really completely exactly builds on what Brett was saying earlier about making people a stakeholder enhances their participation. So it doesn't need to be necessarily just a participant in the process. They can actually contribute in a different way. We've got another question here, which is about the diversity and demographic data. So categories for selecting an assembly can often be quite broad with limited diversity within the category. How can we use demographic data to diversify further? I guess this sort of reflects on, say, if you have maybe you have a minority group within the selection for the Citizens' Assembly, but maybe they're still of a higher social sort of status, economic status, and how do you get people from that minority who might actually be less? And I know you've already touched on that kind of, you can make people representative, but how can we actually improve that diversity within the demographics of the assembly participants? Who would like to take that one? Brett, you've got your hands up.
I'll reiterate a bit Marcin's comments that the process is really, really important. That actually who is in the room, it doesn't have to be a perfect microcosm. It just has to be diverse. Okay, there will always be a lot of debate to be had about exactly what that diversity means. So, for example, for the UK Citizens' Assembly, we look at the census data, and it says Black, Asian, mixed, other ethnicities form around 10% of the population, or 14%, whatever it is, I can't remember. And we could try to break those down into all their different ethnicities if we'd like, but then the question is, where do you stop? Where do you stop in terms of geography? Where do you stop in terms of age? Of course, we did like 4 age categories or 5 age categories. We could have, of course, broken all those age categories down even further. But I think it misses some of the essential point that you just have to ensure that there's a diversity, And if you break them all down too far, it just makes the actual second stratified selection impossible to perform. If we're really worried about excluded minorities not being in there, after we've done all, sent extra invites to those regions there, then I think we have to, look at these other techniques of inclusion, essentially. You can do direct outreach. If it's a specific, if you think that the topic of the assembly is specifically likely to highly affect a certain demographic, then of course you should reach out and make sure they are included either in the assembly or in the stakeholder group. We did a citizens assembly on hate crime, so of course there was a lot of work on minorities, on LGBTQ+, etc., making sure that their voice was brought into the room, given that we didn't want to, for example, ask when they're registering, what is your sexual identity, etc. So yeah, it's a continual trade-off between making sure there's diversity and making sure that you can actually do the stratified selection in the first place. But again, I think the really important thing is the process. It's what goes on in the assembly that's even more important.
Thanks, Brett. Okay, Marcin, you wanted to say something there? Great.
Yes. So, like for me, when I think about what are the right criteria, demographic criteria for the group, for the ideal composition? Like the question that I ask is, or that I would ask is, do I trust this group? Is this group like trustworthy, credible enough? That's number one criteria. Also, you could ask, is this group inclusive enough? And definitely, like, when I'm thinking about designing a citizens' assembly in another city than I live or in another country, it would not be my role. It would be the role of people who live there to say, we need those criteria, because otherwise it would not be trustworthy enough for us. For some people, for example, it is important to include the economic criteria. For me, it's not completely. For me, it's like we don't use it. From the very beginning, it was something secondary. But however, do we get those diverse perspectives of economic background in the room? Yes, we do. How? Through the random selection. And what is very important, the size of the group. It does really matter. If it's 25, your number of perspectives, 25 people, your number of perspectives just go down. Really, it's like too low. So that's why recommended size for a citizens' assembly in Poland is minimum 50. And to just make sure that the diversity is enough, we add 10 people on top of it. So normally it's 60. And in the city of Wrocław, they have increased it even to 75. But my feeling is like, oh, that is like a bit too much because of the size of the room that you need and so on. But if it is the question for the people from the area, what demographic criteria do you need to trust this group? And for example, in Estonia, they have people who speak Russian with a Russian background. It is very important for them to include those. But in Poland, no, it's irrelevant, completely irrelevant. In the United States, a very important question is, are you Republican or Democrat? Is it important in France? No. Is it important in UK? No. It's a country specific, it's locally specific criteria.
Thanks, Marcin. Any further comments with the panel on that one? We have time for, I think, just one more question. So I'm going to pop that out to you in a moment. Okay, let's move on to that final question and then we will wrap up. So how, so this reflects back actually to, I think, maybe the diversity within the group and those targeting, bringing stakeholders in potentially who could have been participants, but making sure their voices are heard, but slightly different angle. So how can it really be ensured that special interest groups do not manage to control the agenda and influence facts presented and or the alternatives to be considered? Marcin,
I'll be happy to answer that because it's our specialty. And so it is very important how you design the governance structure. And for us, you have all those check and balances mechanism just to make sure that it is all done in a right way. And by right way, I mean by keeping the basic standards. So first of all, you need to have those basic standards, like presenting the maximum diversity of perspective, including all stakeholders, openness for every citizens to provide input, and so on. You need those random selection, deliberation. There is a list of 12 basic standards, but then you have the coordinating team running the whole process. And there is a second body, there is a monitoring team, which provides an oversight, and it checks. It includes on the local level representatives of the mayor, representatives of the stakeholders, NGOs in this case, and representatives of the city council, all political clubs. It's a huge group in the city of Wrocław, 18 people. And their role, for example, is they have a final say of who is the stakeholder. Our role as coordinators is to identify the stakeholders, not select, identify and invite them. And if someone says, oh, we should be invited, and we say no, then they have this appeal procedure. They can go to the monitoring group and say, oh, those guys from the coordinating group, they just thrown us out. But we would like to be there because we claim that we are the stakeholders. And the final word is for the monitoring team. Also, the program, the experts chosen, this is all checked with the stakeholders, with other experts. There is a whole process of how you do it, of how you make sure. And if the monitoring team says, you know, this guy who you have invited is not the best, it's not an expert at all. It's just a lobbyist hired, you know, just like in this example. And we say, no, it's a real expert. And they say, no, it's a lobbyist, just throw me away. If there is a disagreement, there is a special arbitration process. And for this case, there would be randomly selected 4 arbiters to have a final say with regards to this question, should this person be included as an expert or not. It is also important for us that we have as many experts' voices presented to the assembly. And for example, if you have 10 time slots for experts to speak, and you have 20 more experts left on your list, then you can invite them to present written statements or to make a recording, just not to delete the experts' positions. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Marcin. Have we any more comments from the panel before we wrap up? Any final comments or thoughts before we end this webinar? Okay, thank you very much to all of our speakers, and to Christian for live streaming, Keith and Alex for fielding the questions. So thank you very much for participating in this webinar. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I think just to end with, on this note, we'd like to acknowledge that citizens' assemblies are not perfect, but there clearly would be a major improvement on what we have now. So by giving people, ordinary people, a real voice in their future, and ensuring minority agendas do not determine what facts we hear, and choices are made for the benefit of most, not as they are now for the benefit of the few. So that's how a citizens' assembly could help to improve on how we do our decision making. I'm just going to share a quick slide with you. So this is, you'll be able to see this now. So this is our contact information. So if you want to contact the Citizens Assembly Working Group, then you can contact them on these methods. So either via our website, xrcitizensassembly.uk, on Twitter, we're Citizens XR on Twitter, on Telegram, Citizens Assemblies. You can search for our YouTube channel, or you can email xrcitizensassemblies@protonmail.com. So if this brought up any questions that you would like to hear answered, or if you want to have more information or get involved more with what we're doing, then please do get in touch. We are currently setting up a Citizens Assembly advocate network to help enhance understanding within XR and with outside of XR as well of what a Citizens Assembly is and why we're advocating for it to tackle the climate crisis. So if you want to find out more about that, please do get in touch with us on any of these channels, and we'll help you to understand a little bit more and get you involved in this process. So so just like to say thank you once again to all of our speakers. Thanks for a fascinating discussion, and yeah, have a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are.
Thank you.